Gert Biesta, thanks for accepting my invitation to be on my podcast.
My pleasure.
Good to see you again.
Yep.
We caught up again in Berlin recently, which was great. And the first question I like to ask all my guests, particularly invited guests, is, there'll be a lot of people who'll be listening who might not know you, which would be surprising because you are a very popular character in the world of education. But for those people who are not listening, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Where shall I start? I was not a very good student in secondary school. So I only just managed to finish that successfully, had no real idea what to do, ended up studying economics for about half a year and was completely lost. Then I studied theology for 2 years, which I really liked, but couldn't see a future for myself. And then I thought I should stop going to university and get a job. And I ended up with a job in a hospital where I got a certificate as an X-ray technician. So I'm fully qualified in making X-ray pictures. And then someone there said, would you like to teach a bit on our program? And I said, yes, I'd love to do that. And that was my start in teaching, not with only qualifications, but with enthusiasm and hard work. And I ended up teaching physics for about 10 years. And then I did a teacher education program for that. And I got so interested in education that I went to evening university, did a degree in education as a subject in itself, theory and history of education, and did a degree in philosophy. And that sort of got me hooked in higher education. For about 10 years, I worked in the Netherlands at universities. And then I moved to England, where I experienced much more intellectual freedom. So I've been living in the UK for the past 27 years, worked in different places, and I think written quite a lot that all goes to the bigger questions about education, I think. And I'm very surprised that the questions I ask are also the questions that other people find interesting. So I'm very surprised that my work is translated in 21 or 22 languages. So it connects. And that's quite rewarding, not for me, but because I think I care about education, and if other people find that helpful and see the same problems, that I think is good. That's a story of my life.
You've done very well to keep that within a very, kind of tight time frame. Some people I ask, they can take 15, 20 minutes to answer that question, of course. Now, you've made a few interesting points in there, which I'll probably pick up on. But the first one I have to ask you, and it was interesting that you're aware of this anyway, and I'd be surprised if you weren't aware of it, because you mentioned your work being published in different languages. And your work does get cited a lot, particularly by classroom teachers or educational practitioners, teachers, whatever you want to refer to at this point in time. But I guess the obvious question, maybe it's not an obvious question, but I'm interested in your thoughts about why you think your work is so popular.
Partly I don't know, so it's also a question for me, but I think it speaks to things that are real, that teachers also experience. And sometimes when I get feedback, what I hear regularly and really find nice to hear is when teachers, and it really is at the level of teachers, you're right about that, where they say your work gives language to what we feel or are concerned about or are excited about, but for which we didn't have language or have lost language. So it's very interesting that they mention this point of language. And say, actually, when we read your work, suddenly we have the language to talk about the things that really matter. And also we have a language to speak back to developments that we don't like or are concerned about. And I find that interesting, also because when you ask what is the significance of educational research and educational scholarship for educational practice, there is this massive trend that says, well, at the most basic level, we need evidence about what works. And the assumption there is that the contribution of research is to tell teachers what they should do. And for me, that is very unhelpful, because if someone tells you what you should do, it immediately stops you from thinking or from having the professional space to make your own decisions and your own judgments. But if work gives you language to talk about what you're doing, language where you can suddenly see things in a different perspective or a different light, I think it enhances your own professionality and your opportunity for judgment. And I think my work is somewhere in that space. And yeah, whereas some people say, well, what's the use of theory? I actually think the practical significance of theory is much bigger than we assume. And all this work that only takes this instrumental approach to teachers, at the end of the day, it doesn't help the profession. And yeah, I see that the field just jumps from one fashion to the next fashion to the next fashion, but it's also not very sustainable. So that's where I sort of see a big difference in educational scholarship at large. But for me, it also helps to understand why my work is taken up and how it's taken up, because I think it takes teachers seriously.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you've hit on some very strong points around, language for teachers to use, advocacy around profession, which is normally at the margins, no matter what country or sector, education is just generally at the margins. So I think you've picked up some really strong points there, and I think that's the feedback I also hear as well. And obviously it also transcends, higher ed as well. In terms of research, I do have a question for you on research on my list here, so we will get to that. So I like your response. Now let's get to some of my questions that I've got planned here. So you coined the term learnification. I actually happen to like what you've got here, but I'll get to my question. So you turn the term learnification to describe how educational discourse has shifted from talking about education and teaching to talking about learning. So what's fundamentally wrong with this shift? I mean, how is the language of learning hidden crucial questions about content, purpose, and relationships in education?
Yeah. I'll see if I can respond to a number of dimensions of that, because the discussion has expanded over the years. But again, I'm pretty proud that I've invented the word that people are using it. I think one problem with learning, if you use that as a term and say the point of education is to make students learn, is that very quickly you forget precisely the question of purpose, what to learn for, and the question of content, what to learn about. And therefore, I've already warned long ago that if we only talk about learning, we are no longer asking the educational questions, because learning can go in any direction. I was emailing with someone just this morning to say, of course, what Russia is doing with children in occupied parts of the Ukraine is also to make those children learn. But they want them to learn in a very particular way, a distorted Russian view of history, learning problematic values. So if we only have the language of learning, and some people say all education should begin with theorizing how children learn, I think that's the wrong starting point, because learning goes in many different directions, and in a sense, it's empty. And as educators, our concern is about what students should learn, what is worth to pay attention to and to engage with as a student, but also why we want to do that. And there I would say, for me, education has to be emancipatory. It's a big term, but we ultimately, the joke is to say good teachers want to get rid of their students. Not immediately, but at some point we want our students to be able to lead their own lives. That's what emancipation means. And that requires at least to look at very particular qualities of learning. So that the language of learning is just too empty and too formal. And when I read, and I think I read that a couple of years ago in an official Australian document on teacher education, where it says teacher education needs to start with an understanding of learning and how the brain works, I think then you start completely at the wrong end. So there is one big concern. Maybe the other to mention is that when you look at human beings in terms of learning, you do two things. You put them in a particular relationship with their environments, where you can say, well, the human being can learn, and of course that's true. We can change as a result of the interaction with our environments. But I would say that's not the only way in which we exist as human beings. We are not just learning organisms. And I would say it's not distinctive, because animals can also learn in that way. We know that machines can learn in that way. They can change in response to interaction with the environment. And therefore, the other problem with learning, where I think it is too narrow, is that we miss all kind of other ways in which we are in relationship with the world. So even this conversation we are having, and sorry, I'm talking a lot, and you ask the questions. But this is a meeting of two people where I am not here just as a learner. I'm here to respond to questions. So it's already very interesting that as human beings, we can encounter questions. We can encounter other human beings who speak to us, who maybe look at us with some expectation. That's already a completely different way to be in the world. And therefore, I also like this other question, not the question, what can I learn, but what actually is the world asking of me? For me, that opens up much more about our human existence. And I think that's important in education. And then I would say this is precisely what animals and machines don't have. They can learn, they can creatively adapt to changing environments, but they cannot be addressed. They cannot be spoken to. In one of my books, I have this example of the robot vacuum cleaner, which is, I think, a good example of a learning machine. And you put it in a room and it begins to clean the room, and over time it becomes more effective at doing that. But you cannot say to that robot, how are you doing, or what are you doing here? The only thing you can do is put the machine in a different room, and it will start adjusting to that room. but it will only do that as a learning organism. And also, those machines, they have no capacity for judgment. So again, machines can learn, but the robot vacuum cleaner will be happy to clean the office of Putin or the office of Zelensky. So all of that, you can see that learning doesn't go to the heart of our human existence. And for me, that cluster is the other problem with learning.
Yeah, I mean, even the opportunity to say, "Oh, how you feeling?" or "How do you feel about cleaning the?" I have a question about subjectivity in my list here, so I will get to that in a minute. But I thought I would go to a question of I want to ask you before I go to a question of on teaching. You made a good point about there's a certain, particularly in educational discourse, there's a kind of obsession with learning, and I would agree with that. Why do you think there's this obsession with learning?
So I understand that historically, because there are really awful examples of education where teachers only talk, where they don't really pay attention to what students can do with that or do with that. And then at some point, students get an exam, and some pass and some fail. Or even worse, very authoritarian, explicitly authoritarian systems of education, where the only ambition is to control students. That, I think, is problematic anyway. That is indoctrination or brainwashing at the end of the day. But there are also, pretty one-directional practices of education where the teacher simply assumes that some students will get it and other students won't get it, and that's it. And there I can understand that this turn towards learning to say, well, wait a minute, shouldn't all students benefit from what's going on? Shouldn't we focus on what they get from it rather than what teachers do? There I see that the language of learning, and to say, actually, we should be concerned about what students learn here, not what teachers wanted to do. That historically, that makes sense. I also often refer to a book by Carl Rogers, Freedom to Learn, where he says, if teaching is just authoritarian, if education is just authoritarian, we need to reclaim the freedom to learn. So I think that is true. But then, as I've just tried to explain, learning itself is just a very unhelpful language to really get to the dynamics of what is happening in education.
Yeah. All right, now to a question on teaching. So it is a bit of a link to what we've been talking about. So I think it's a nice segue. Now, you describe teaching not as facilitating learning, and we've talked a bit about learning already, but as interrupting students, challenging their egocentric orientations by presenting them with otherness. That's a very important term that you and I, who are interested in continental philosophy, know a lot about. This seems almost confrontational. Now, can you explain what you mean by interruption, and then how this differs from, say, both traditional authoritarian type teaching? You did mention that before, but and progressive student-centered approaches, which are obviously put together as each side of the extreme on the teaching continuum. You could almost argue authoritarian direct instruction, what we like to call explicit teaching, at one end, and then progressive student-centered at the other end, just to use as a descriptor. So,
Okay, let's say a bit about teaching and then see where we want to take this. And this word interruption, which I've been using. I have some other words, so I will add another word that helps there as well. And maybe a blunt way of putting it is to say, well, if you want to learn, you don't really need a teacher. Particularly nowadays, there is so much information on the internet. There are all kind of algorithms on the internet. So anything you sort of want to learn, you can probably learn. I see it with my youngest son, who bought a house that needed a lot of work. And suddenly he is able to do plumbing and plastering and all that. And when I ask him, where did you learn that? And he said, oh, just look it up on YouTube. So for learning, you can say you don't need education. And I actually made a principle out of that to say education only has a point for those things that cannot happen without education. So we should be quite precise and maybe quite precious about what we need education for. And there's a lot for which we don't need education. But we do not need education, I think, for those things that students didn't even know they could ask for, or didn't even were aware that they exist. So I think the importance of teaching is, with a nice metaphor, to open doors to the world for our students, where many students didn't even know that there was a door, or where some students felt that that was not a door for them. So in some of my work, I've been talking about teaching as a gift, where we give students, in a sense, and this is also my sense of humor, basically we should give students what they don't ask for. Because if we only give them what they ask for, we keep them where they are. Because you can only ask for what you know you can ask for. But the beauty of teaching, you can say, is to give students more. To give them difficult questions about history, for example. Not difficult in a cognitive sense, but to look honestly at your own history or the history of your country. You will also find difficult questions. So this teaching as a gift is not just pleasant, but it can also be hard work. And therefore, you can say, if we really try to bring new things to our students, if we open doors that they weren't aware that there were questions or bodies of knowledge or of practice, that of course interrupts where students are. And that's why you can say teaching that really is teaching and not already doing what students are already doing has this interruptive quality. Some people like the word interruption, they get it. Others may find it a bit too negative. So the other word I find helpful there is awakening, where you say what we do when we open a door or say to our students, yeah, it's wonderful that you know this or bring this, but have you ever thought of looking in this direction? You can say we try to awaken our students for a much bigger world. But that's also a moment of interrupting where students are. And there, I think, we talk about dimensions of education that really make a difference, that students cannot do for themselves or will not find on the internet, for example. And for me, that's the importance of teaching.
I think we've had a conversation before about, you talked a lot about the gift, how there's a very theological component to it. In Protestant traditions or even Christian traditions, you're familiar with the theological term of grace.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds very much, when I hear you talk about the gift of teaching, I always think of it as the same thing as grace and theology, Christian theology. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there is definitely inspiration from theology. Also, as I mentioned, I studied theology for 2 years, and I really like it as an intellectual field, but I couldn't see sort of a future for me to work in that or with that. And I do think that it's important to take theology seriously and not simply to say, oh, that's for believers, and believers are a bit strange people, but if they don't become dangerous, then it's fine. I think theology speaks to the big questions of human existence, and it's important that we understand that as a resource. Mm-hmm. And for me, there are insights like a notion of grace, or also a notion of revelation, which I really like, where you say, what is revelation? That is precisely this moment when something comes to you that you haven't made up. That's not your construction, but that's given to you, which can be an insight or precisely a moment of awakening. So I think theology can help here if we take it seriously in an intellectual way, and not end up in unhelpful discussions about does God exist or not, or what should I believe. I like this little turn. If someone says, I don't believe in God, then I always want to say, but would God believe in you? And I find that a much more interesting question. I had this conversation with my grandson, who is 8, and he has a little brother, and we were visiting over Christmas. And then he said a bit privately, I no longer believe in Father Christmas. And then I said to him, but does Father Christmas believe in you? And then he looked very funny. So I'm curious what happened there. But for me, this is again this difference between learning and being taught. Learning is always about what you think and what you do. But this possibility that you meet another human being who says, I believe in you, that's fantastic. You cannot produce that yourself, but it can be a very significant encounter in your life. And that happens in education as well. A good teacher has to start with saying to all their students, I believe in you. Otherwise, there would be no point in even being together in a classroom.
That's some good points there. I'm sorry, I was listening to what you're saying, taking them in. I think you made some good points about theology. In particular, theology at least attempts at providing some answers to some very big questions. Now, whether you agree with them or not, it doesn't really matter here for this conversation. But I think that's one of the benefits, I guess you could say, of that field of discipline. It attempts to answer some of those kind of big questions. Because I'm fortunate enough to go to an institution that takes philosophy and theology seriously. Sorry, not where I currently work, where I used to study.
Yeah.
And took that very seriously, that discourse. And they're uniquely different, but yet overlapping type conversations to be had. So anyway, we'll get on a bit of a tangent if we keep going there. But now I did say I had a question for you around subjectivity. Now, it's a particular area of interest of mine, but so you make an important distinction in your work between helping students express their existing subjectivity and the process of subjectification, as in becoming a subject, which to me kind of sound one and the same, but you can maybe help me explain a little bit to me how they're a little bit different or the same in a minute. Can you clarify this difference really? Like, are they different or one and the same, or you're making some characterizations that make it different? And then why is it problematic when we simply affirm who students already think they are? So why is that kind of problematic?
Maybe start there. I think it's problematic if we simply say how students are is fine, because that's their right. Because we know from history, or maybe just from reading the news every day, that there are people who say, this is how I am, these are my values, and as a result of that, I'm going to bomb another country. And this sounds quite strong and quite big, but for me, this is maybe precisely the difference I'm after between the subjective or student's identity and the challenge to exist as subject. And I have this word subjectification to say this is actually part of the job of education, that we help students to step from the subjective to existing as subject. And maybe the words or the language doesn't help, but the difference is important. Because I think for all human beings, there is always the big question, what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with everything I know, with everything I'm able to do? And that question for me is the question of how to exist, how to be a subject of your own life, a moral subject, you could say, someone who can judge about what to do and not just be an object of what other people tell you to do. And for me, this is an important also educational transition, because at one level, it's very nice to be an object. If people just tell you what you should do, then there is no need for you to think for yourself or to judge for yourself. But we know all the historical examples where that goes wrong and people are made into objects who just have to follow a strong leader. So you can say, as educators, we should be interested in helping our students to become moral subjects, to always ask the question, is what I think I should do, is that what I should be doing? And I call sort of, keeping that question alive, I call that subjectification, or the task of education to take care of that question. And if we just say all students have the right to express themselves, of course, all students should be able to express what they want, what they think. But then education is the space where we sit together and say, well, wait a minute, is this going to help or hinder? And that for me is this difference between the subjective or the individual or identity on the one hand, and trying to exist as a subject.
And do you think, and do you think, I mean, I guess the obvious question to ask as a follow-up to that is there a point when, or how will you know whether an individual has become who they want to become, like as in become the subject they want to become? Like, does that make sense, what I mean by that question?
Yeah. But I would say this can never be the ambition. It can never be that people become who they want to become. Because then you're only interested in yourself, you could say. So it's much more the question, if we put it a bit strongly, how can you become who you need to become? Of course, everyone has things to offer, and there we differ. But there is a world out there that, in a sense, needs that. So if we only focus on who we want to become and forget this whole world that maybe asks us questions that sometimes fit nicely, but other times there's something needed from us that, again, interrupts where we thought we would want to go.
Yeah.
So to exist as subject is precisely not to do what you want to do, but always put that in a bigger perspective.
It's an existential type question too, because, I mean, of course, there's a bit of tongue-in-cheek when I ask it, because the idea that you can ever become or know when you've become is, first of all, there's a question to be asked around whether that's possible or not. You know what I mean? Like, is it possible, and how would you know? So, like, So I don't mean to get too existentially bogged down here, but I do think that's a relevant question, as in, like, I mean, is it ever possible, to finally, and then how would you know? I mean, I guess,
yeah. So we never know, and we will never reach that point. But the danger is if we think that we can know, and if we think that we have reached that point. There's a beautiful insight in a book from a German scholar, Klaus Mollenhauer, who emphasizes the importance for education of what I would translate as self-uncertainty. Not self-doubt, but self-uncertainty. In German, it's Selbstungewissheit. And he says, if we are 100% certain of ourselves, we are really dangerous. Mm-hmm. Because then we'll just go full speed ahead. So he says the best we should aim for as educators is to help our students to always have a degree of uncertainty about ourselves, because that allows it for us to be moral individuals. But as soon as you're 100% certain, you lack this moment of doubt, of reflection. Mm-hmm. And you can say that's quite odd, because it means that education doesn't have sort of a positive endpoint, or life doesn't come to a positive endpoint. Mm-hmm. You could say the whole point of life is that we keep acting with conscience, and that means with a degree of doubt also, and uncertainty about ourselves.
Mm. Which I dare say is existentially confronting. I know I mentioned earlier about confrontation in a very different way in terms of the teaching enterprise, but I would say this is even more confronting, in relation to, even the whole notion about, whether I truly, you used your different term, but whether I truly know, or, what was the term you used before? You said where you feel not convinced. What was the word that you said that you're, I can't recall.
Certain about yourself?
Yes, certain. I agree. I think if you have I'm very hesitant to say that I'm ever 100% certain, but I think I worry about the individuals who are 100% certain, because generally they are blind to something, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I can understand why that then closes you off, right? It closes you off, which makes that, dare I say it, dangerous. You know what I mean? And I think that's what I kind of hear you saying, but I guess in my own words. But I happen to agree with you there that. But at the same time, that's a very difficult thing to try and explain to someone like a student of yours, particularly a young student. Say a secondary student, and that's very unsettling. Existentially, I mean, unsettling.
So it's not an easy gift, but I think it's the biggest gift we can give to the new generation, to say this world is not a place where that can even survive if human beings are just 100% certain of themselves. Because I think that's a recipe for war. Because if your certainty then clashes with the certainty of another human being, well, the only option you have is to get into a fight. But of course, if you then think educationally, what does this mean? Do we need to sit together at the start of the school year and say, look, I want to ensure that you never become certain of yourself? Of course not. That doesn't touch anything. So I think it's really important in education that we give students many opportunities to experience this terrain of what it means to be certain of yourself, what it means to encounter the world with that certainty, and then begin to realize that there may be some problems there.
Yeah.
I talk an awful lot about clay and working with clay. It's a brilliant example. because quite often when you have a piece of clay, it starts with, I want to make something out of this clay. And quite often when you start doing that, you will encounter a moment where you see, hey, the clay doesn't make this possible. I want to make a vase of half a meter high, but at 30 centimeters, the clay is too heavy and starts to collapse on itself. And suddenly you begin to realize in such a very concrete encounter that the world is real and that not everything that you want from it or think about it is possible. And for me, such an experience is a moment of subjectification where you see that it's not about you, but about how you can get into a dialogue or a meeting with what the world makes possible and also what the world doesn't make possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a heap of opportunities in different curriculum areas to kind of encounter those type of experiences, you know. Perfect example, I know you're former physicist or interested in physics. Some perfect example is colour. Your point of view can change something that's, you know, has a universal property of redness, but then you change your point of view and it looks black or pink, you know. So I think, you know, even from an epistemological point of view, how you can then doubt your senses. And so I think there are many opportunities where, you know, different kind of curriculum areas can provide you with different opportunities to experience what it just means to, you know, not be 100% certain, for instance, to use, you know, So I have no doubts that there are many, many possibilities. And in fact, sometimes they're the most rewarding ones, you know, as a school teacher, you know, where students realize, oh, hang on, what I first thought was the case is actually not the case, you know? Yeah, without a doubt. Oh, we better move on here. I'm conscious of the time. I want to follow on that question here about, about, you know, kind of the teaching profession, education in general. So now you've written a lot about defending the integrity of education and the work of teachers beyond programs and good intentions. Now, it's a kind of devil advocate type question here, but this seems counterintuitive. Now, surely good intentions matter, right? So what's the problem with letting educational aims or good intentions drive teaching practices, right? What's wrong with that, right?
So the worry I have is that we turn education too quickly into an instrument to achieve these intentions. And of course, good intentions are fine, but education is a very particular way to get somewhere that has its own qualities, its own integrity. And if the only way to frame education is to say, well, these are the outcomes we need to achieve, and we're going to push students so that they get there, then there's a risk that the trajectory becomes uneducational or even destructive. We know that systems that put massive pressure on student performance really destroy the lives of young people. So we have to understand that education is not simply this instrument that if we have the right intentions, then we can just get on with it. Education is this, I would say, slow human encounter where we provide all kind of openings for our students, opportunities, hope that they step into that, hold them with the difficulty. So the journey matters, but also the qualities matter. And if we focus too much just on the intentions, or even more sort of instrumentalized just on the learning outcomes and do not really care about what the quality of the journey itself is, then I think we begin to undermine education.
Yeah. I think it's always the old chestnut, you know, like I had the best intentions, and as long as I had the best intentions, but if there was a poor outcome, then somehow that's justifiable, right? That the outcome. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Like, if we now, kind of consider it from an educational point of view, this you mentioned before about this kind of constant shift to whatever the trends are. I mean, it's a perfect example of good intentions, right? We're just constantly moving to the next. Most educators I know have the best intentions, right? Yeah. But then, so do you get my kind of question here in relation to that?
Not entirely. Can you?
Well, I mean, I happen to agree with you that education is constantly shifting to the next trend. Sitting behind that are reformers who are perennially always saying, "I have the best intentions, and that's why I'm activating this reform, and so therefore I'm justifiable in what happened, irrespective of the outcome." That's basically what I meant.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems I see that a lot of intentions in education that come from policy or also from educators at some point begin to forget the emancipatory, task of education. So when you begin to measure a lot about education and look at test scores and student performance, you will always find patterns, and many of these patterns show all kinds of inequalities. And a lot of these inequalities are really shameful, you could say. That if you come from a economically poorer background or from a culturally poorer background, you will do less well in terms of the game of schooling. But then to simply say, we can fix that if we do explicit direct instruction or do formative assessment and constantly, almost every hour, I think, measure the progress of students towards this particular outcome, then before you know it, you have created a system that comes out of a meaningful concern to address inequality, but the system itself becomes an oppressive machine, you could say. That's what I see happening a lot. And it's one of the points I often make, where I say the whole interest in school effectiveness comes out of a social justice argument. The people who do that work really share the concern I also have. How can we make sure that all children can benefit from education? But if you then begin to say, we need to make sure that all the interventions are effective, and effectiveness means that they produce test scores, then I think you begin to create a system that is no longer educational. For example, because the only criterion of the significance of education become the test scores, or what PISA is doing in comparing countries. It takes such a very narrow view of what matters in education, and such a narrow slice to even measure that. And then it suddenly begins to compare countries and make big claims about that system is much better than that system. Now, if you fall for those kind of promises, I think it leads to what I've called a distortion of education rather than that it helps. And I think that's where I have a big worry, that if we just drive, you can say, effectively towards good intentions or desired outcomes, in the meantime, we are transforming education into an oppressive system, I think, for students and for teachers.
Well, it's what's driving the good intentions. Most of the time, these reformers have no prior thought to the consequences, but because they're driven by best intentions, social justice, kind of principles, ideas, dare I say, ideology, they have no concern about potential outcomes or sorry, I don't want to use the term outcomes. I want to say potential consequences.
Yeah.
And I somehow feel like the two of you somehow don't meet. I guess that's why I asked the question, because sometimes there's no thought about the consequences of the reform agenda or what you might action, say in policy A, B, and C, which is part of the reform agenda. I don't know. Do you think that's a fair observation?
Yeah. And I think it has a lot to do with that the good intentions are too often taken up as, you can say, instrumental questions about how do we instrumentalize education so that we can get there, and forget that education is not an instrument, and education ultimately has to be there in the service of the wise freedom of the student, to put it like that.
Yeah.
But of course, the problem is also the tension between education as a practice, what happens in classrooms, what teachers do individually and collectively, and education as a system. And I think a lot of policy, also connected to research, looks too much at education as a system. I see it in the Netherlands, where there is a new law on citizenship education, and there are good reasons for that. The law could have been better. But then education in the Netherlands has a school inspection system. And then the school inspectors say, well, what do we need to look at in order to judge whether schools are doing their job well? So you get a whole protocol of pages and pages of indicators. They take that to a school, they do the tick box, and then they say to the school, you're not doing your job well because you don't meet the indicators. And there you can see the clash between the practice, where, of course, a lot of what teachers are doing is very significant. But if you come to that just with a system view, you have a mismatch. And it becomes then a burden for schools to meet the demands of the systems, rather than to say, we want to take on this question of citizenship, but that is a question of practice, and we have important things to do, and maybe we should indeed do more than we used to do. So for me, there is something here that really is problematic, that policy too often just takes a system approach and doesn't understand that practice, the everyday teaching, the everyday encounter, the culture of a school is not a matter of the functioning of systems.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a follow-on question from that, but just do it differently. So I'm interested in your thoughts about whether you've seen examples of, say, educational practice and even educational systems that are working well.
So partly I would
answer honestly.
Honestly.
Your answer could be, I can't find it anywhere.
No, I would say at the level of practice, I see an awful lot of wonderful things happening. So my concern is often more at the level of systems. When I look at England, for example, the government has been interfering for years in education and tried to control it as a system, also with a lot of school inspection, a lot of pressure, very prescriptive curricula. And since I live in Scotland, which has its own policies and its own remit, a lot of colleagues say, as soon as I moved to Scotland, I forgot everything about England because it's so bad. And I think at the system level, it's very problematic what's happening in England. But when I meet teachers and when I meet school principals, I meet fantastic people who often say, the system is bad, but let me tell you what we do in our school and how we make this work and what kind of decisions we make. So, of course, there is a whole spectrum, but I meet educators at the level of practice who, even in systems that are problematic, do wonderful things.
Yeah, I think it's important to hear that. I think there's a lot of doom and gloom, and education is perennially, kind of criticized for a whole range of things. And I think it's important that we just remind ourselves that, in individual classrooms, individual teachers, I would say the majority of the time are really, really making a difference. And I'm being intentional when I say that. But I agree that from an educational systems point of view, this is where we start to encounter some problems, top-down, type interference that you're talking about.
The problem is systems can never be really intelligent. They can adapt and change, but always at the system level. But practices can be thoughtful, can be intelligent. I worry, of course, about teachers who believe too much in the promises of systems or the promises of research. So there, I think, in my work, I keep gently sort of pushing and asking questions. I've also seen systems where a lot of people say, oh, that's a really good system. Finland has been sort of singled out as, there must be something special happening in Finland.
Yes, it's always put forward as the golden system, the golden measure, educational system.
And I speak to people in Finland who say this has been a bit of a burden because we don't think there is anything special, and everyone traveling to Finland and ask, what should we look at? They say, well, there's nothing to look at. We just do our job. So I also think if there is something interesting happening in Finland, it comes out of a particular culture, out of a particular history. So you cannot say what's the secret of their teaching or the secret of their curriculum. It's a very complex setup. And I've also had the privilege to be in classrooms in Finland, which I felt were a bit boring, could do with a bit more excitement. So I also worried a little about the practice there, that I thought, well, is this it? But I think for me, this is the important insight, the level of system and the level of practice. That creates a lot of problems.
Yeah, that makes a good. You make some interesting points there that I happen to agree with. No surprise there. All right, so we've got 3 questions to go. We're on the home stretch, right?
Yes.
Now I have to ask you a question about educational research, right? So so now you've been critical of how educational research, particularly the demand that teachers become researchers themselves, can actually interfere with what education should be doing. Now, can you explain this concern? And then what does research, I'll start that again. I'll rephrase that again. When does research serve education and when does it undermine it?
Yeah. Big question, but it connects a bit also to where we started. So for me, the image is that if you want to become better at playing the piano, you have to practice playing the piano. And if you think you can become better at playing the piano by researching piano playing, you don't understand what a practice is. For me, this is already a very fundamental point, that I don't think that the work of the teacher can be compared to the work of a researcher. Researcher looks at a practice from the outside, but the teacher is inside the practice, and they have to make the practice happen, have to make the practice work. And that means to be in the practice. It's playing the piano, it's rehearsing the piano. Of course, you want to do that in a thoughtful way, but my concern with research is that suddenly you become a viewer from the outside of your practice, rather than that you keep working on making your practice better. For me, there is something there that when I hear, teachers should become researchers, I always say, well, wait a minute, because the eye of the researcher is a very different eye from the eye of the teacher or the practitioner. And this, I think, is also scaled up, that you can say, well, how can research be helpful for practice, it has to begin with a really good understanding of what the practice itself is. A lot of the what works research, for me, starts already with a distorted understanding of the practice. When you talk about teaching as an intervention to generate outcomes, I would say you've never been in the classroom, because teachers don't intervene upon students to get outcomes.
Yeah, that's the medical model. The medical model of, interventions, right? If I do intervention X, Y, and Z, it will lead to, outcome A, B, and C. I've always been bothered by that medical model that's in play, right? And of course it's been advocated for because there's this push for teaching to be viewed as a profession, right? There's a debate there around whether it's a profession or not. And I don't know if we got time to get into that in a minute, but that medical model which you were talking about with the interventions, right? Maybe you could talk a little about where that came from and why, it's being used in education.
Actually, if you go to older literature, before it was called the medical model, it was called the agricultural model.
Okay.
Where, people say you have these field tests where you have 2 fields with potatoes and you spray one field with this and another field with that. And then you see, where you get the best potatoes or the biggest potatoes or the cheapest potatoes. That's where it started. And then I think in medicine, a couple of decades ago, people started to say medicine needs to become more evidence-based. But when you look at the history in medicine, when they talk about evidence-based medicine, they say this is about clinical judgment. So they don't say, let's get rid of the clinical judgment and let's get evidence in place of it. They say, how can we support clinical judgment? How can we support the judgment of individual medical doctors who always engage with unique patients, never with an average patient? And then you can say, well, it can be very interesting to learn from other situations, patients with similar complaints or similar patterns, where we tried particular therapies or particular drugs and see what happened there. But one of the I think the big figures in evidence-based medicine, I think he's called Hugh Socket or something like that. He has a very nice quote where he says, if the patient in front of me fits the evidence, then great, then I can do something with the evidence. But if the patient doesn't fit the evidence, then he says, I quote him here, then just piss on the evidence, because the evidence is trivial. And that is to really understand what clinical judgment is and what evidence-based medicine is. But I think in education, this has been turned into something completely different, where people say, let's get rid of the judgment of teachers, because that's all subjective and situated. If they just follow the evidence, if they just do what works, then everything will be fine. And I think that's already based on a misunderstanding of what evidence-based medicine is. And I think it's closer to this agricultural model, where you just have willing potatoes and not human beings you're interacting with.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I like how you characterize that, because in one sense, it's a nice segue into this bit about professionalism. And I mean, surely this push for teaching to be taken seriously as a legitimate profession, surely this has then contributed, either directly or indirectly, it has contributed to this kind of advocacy, of seeing teaching as a profession. Now, I guess my obvious question to you is teaching a profession? And then I'll probably go from there, because this is a big one, right? This is a huge one for a lot of people. There are huge question marks over whether it's a profession or not. And so I guess you're the perfect person to ask, really.
Yeah. So in the abstract, you can either say it is a profession or it isn't a profession, but that's not the difference that matters. Only at the level of prestige that you can say, well, if we can call teaching a profession, then it's up there with other professions that have prestige. But when you look at sort of the theory around professions, one important quality of professions is that we call work professional work when it has a central concern for the well-being of human beings. That's what you see in medical profession or in legal profession, and I think that's at the heart of education as well. We don't teach to please the government or to score high in PISA. We teach because we care about our students and their lives. So that's an important reason for saying, yes, we are there. And then you can say the other reasons for calling a field of practice a profession is because it requires from the professionals knowledge and skills that you cannot simply automate or put into rules. If you work in a car factory, quite often people can exactly say what you need to do, and if you just follow the prescription, then you do a good job. Of course, you have to keep your eyes open, because if a car falls from the conveyor belt, then you have to act, and you cannot say, oh, that wasn't in my job description. So you can say it requires quite a high level of skills, of understanding, of thoughtfulness. But most of all, what it requires is judgment. Because in professions, you never deal with, I use the phrase willing potatoes, who in a sense are all the same potato. You encounter human beings who are at a particular stage of their life, have their strengths, have their flaws, have their challenges. And that's where you need to be as a teacher or as a professional. And for me, these are the qualities that are distinctive about education, which are similar to medical doctors, who also have a concern for the well-being of human beings, need a high level of skill and understanding. But most of all, they don't apply that in a mechanistic way, but also always through judgment, to thoughtful action. And for me, those would be the claims for saying, yes, let's understand teaching as a profession. And then you could say, yes, as teachers, now we're a profession, so now we can stop doing our work. I would say the opposite. If you say teaching is a profession, it puts the bar much higher. It gives you even more responsibility to do that work well and in a thoughtful manner.
Yeah. I think part of my skepticism is a lot of the agendas around, the drive for teaching as a profession is around, kind of unions and other advocacy groups who are pushing for, pay rises, increased entitlements, work-related entitlements, and so on and so forth. And so I think they've just got it all wrong. I mean, I can understand why unions would be working and pushing hard for pay and work-related conditions. That's what unions exist there for, right? I completely get it. But then at the end, but as a consequence of doing that, they've cut their nose off in spite of their face.
Yeah. That's the problem. And I think that's where, at one point, the fight over is it a profession or not, if it's about this, then it can become trivial. I'm too much of a Marxist not to say that, teaching is this calling and teachers should give their whole life to their students. No, teaching is also work, and it needs a proper salary and proper support and resources. Yeah. But it's a particular kind of work, and that's where we need to have the conversation. And I think the defense of teaching as a special work.
Yeah. I think there is a lot we could talk about here, and I'm conscious of time. We've been going for a while. Now, and I'm a bit of a naughty boy. I'll give myself a smack on the hand here. I did say 3 questions, and we've already gone past those 3 questions about 4 or 5 questions ago. So I will get to my second last question. I always ask my invited guests is, now, what 3 books would you recommend or that have either influenced your thinking and why? Now, again, this is your chance. You can plug one of your latest publications. You can answer this however you like, but 3 books that have been influential on your thinking and why.
Yeah. So that's a wonderful question also, because over the years I've bought far too many books and it became a burden in my house. So I have been really trying to select the books I still want something with, or books that still want something from me. So I'll just select 3 that I'd like to mention. Yeah. Oh, I should have done my homework, but I'll mention 3.
Okay.
One is a book by Klaus Mollenhauer, who I already mentioned, a German scholar who did a lot of work in the decades after the Second World War, and really engaged with this big question in Germany, where they said, we thought we had the best education system in the world. How has it been possible that became so corrupted and co-opted by Nazi ideology? So he became a figure in critical educational theory in the 60s. And then in the early 80s, he wrote a book, which in English, the title has been translated as Forgotten Connections, where he said, yeah, it's fantastic that we have made this social and critical turn in education, but we shouldn't forget the importance of, I would say, the practice of education itself. And then he wrote this beautiful book, where he says we have forgotten a couple of connections. And it's a very strange book, and it goes in all kind of directions, but at the same time, I think it's very profound. When I started out as a teacher in university programs, this is the book I put on the reading list. And the last lecture and session I did when I finished my job in Ireland last year was still about that book. So it's a very rich resource, at least for me. And it's called, there is an English translation, which is quite unique, because a lot of German scholarship is not available in English, but it's called Forgotten Connections. And it's one book I would really encourage everyone to work with.
We'll list these in the episode description.
Yes,
the details.
Then and in that book, Mollenhauer makes this point about self-uncertainty. So that's also why the book is so important, I think, for me. The other book is not this book, but it is a book also written by Martin Buber. And I couldn't immediately find the book, but it's a book with essays also on education. And there is one essay on character education, or on the education of character, I think it's called. Now for me, that's the second book, or even that text I would put on the list, because halfway that chapter, he says, what is the main task of every true educator in our time? And then he says it is to maintain the pain and arouse the desire. And it's a very strange sentence the first time I encountered it through work of a colleague, to maintain the pain and arouse the desire. But it goes to the same point, because the pain that Buber is talking about is the pain of moral conscience, the pain of self-uncertainty, because it's far easier to just lead your life and be certain about yourself. And it's far more difficult to always ask this painful question, am I doing the right thing? So it's so interesting that Buber says that, and he warns against this idea that if we as educators just think, oh, if children get a strong character, then everything will be fine. He says, no, there is this moment of interruption that we need to cherish, because that will allow us to exist as moral beings. Not to interrupt our students to destroy and frustrate their lives, but then to arouse the desire, he says, precisely to arouse the desire to want to live your life and contribute to the life together. So that for me would be the second book. And then maybe I make a cheap plug for my book, World-Centered Education.
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah, because I've written a lot, obviously too much. And there were sort of 5 big books. Beyond Learning, Good Education, Age of Measurement, The Beautiful Risk of Education, A Rediscovery of Teaching, and then the 5th in that is called World-Centered Education. And I'm still quite happy with that book because it brings a lot of my ideas together. And I think it's also important for people to understand that to write and to be a scholar, it doesn't mean that you already know everything you're going to write. Writing itself is a process of discovery. So there are themes that I've been working on for a long time. But in that book, I think I managed to bring them together in a pretty powerful way. What I like about the title is that I say, look, there is this ongoing fight, should education be curriculum-centered or student-centered? And I find that a very unhelpful discussion because, of course, in education, we need students and we need curriculum. But our job is, first of all, to bring the two together, to give the curriculum to the students and to encourage the students to step to the doors we open there. But we ultimately do that because we hope that our students want to take this step into the world and lead their own life there. So for me, world-centered education is to say that is actually what should be in the center of our concerns. And I say in the book, maybe this is the last book I need to write because I don't have that much more to say. And I think this book is good enough. But still, I can't help myself. So maybe
I think there'll be others, I'm sure. I have to ask you, before I ask my last question, how have you been prolific? I mean, like you obviously acknowledge yourself, you have been prolific. And so, like, what's your secret? Like, is there a secret you want to tell listeners, or is it just something you just enjoy doing?
I think I enjoy doing it. There is something nice about writing. Yeah, it's very private, the sphere of writing. I travel a fair bit, so I also have this time at airports or on trains, which for me is always quite productive time. But a lot of my writing comes out of my own teaching. For me, teaching remains also the most beautiful space where new things emerge, where you suddenly soon see new things, or you see yourself doing new things. So that, I think that's part of it. And there is a bit of a motivation that I see this whole field of education going in a direction that for me lacks thoughtfulness. So I also still feel it's important to have at least a different voice. I don't want people to become my followers. I get very nervous of that. So I only justify my scholarship by saying, look, I try to say something different from where I see a lot of policy or research going. And as long as we have two options, we can remain awake, because then we know that we are making a choice if we go left or right. That for me is the most important, I think, political motivation for what I do. Not to tell people what they should think, but to say there should always be an alternative way of looking at things, because only then we can judge and decide. And if we say there is only one way, then we are lost. Then thinking is no longer possible.
Would you say you're a natural writer? Like, is it like you don't have to work at it? Like, as in you construct, like paragraphs, chapters, like quickly, or is it you have to work at it, or like how would you describe your your writing?
Sometimes it goes fast and there is a nice flow. But mostly when writing a book, I get stuck halfway. And I now know that I need to give it time and cannot push. And often I stop for half a year and then I revisit and then I can see a way forward. But books are a bit of a struggle, but when they come together, it's very nice.
No, thanks for sharing that. I end up asking a lot of my invited guests very similar type questions around writing, because I think there are a lot of people, out there who, particularly academic writing as a discourse or as a genre, probably genre is probably more accurate, is very different type genre. And then there's this kind of perception out there that somehow, kind of academics, all they do is just, from 9 to 5, write things kind of thing. I tried to explain to someone the other day, no, that's actually not my experiences, and at least not my experiences from talking to colleagues. So I find it painful. So, you know what I mean? Yes. Like it's painful. Yeah.
But if painful. If you end up with something interesting, and I see, I worry that. If you look at the number of journal articles that is produced every day in the world, it's too much. And I see a lot of young scholars are under pressure to publish and publish in particular journals.
That's correct.
And then they are being told there is only one way to write an academic paper and you should follow the rules. And as a journal editor, I see far too many papers that all look the same and that are, without wanting to insult the author, but that are just trivial. And I think it's so important also to reclaim scholarship and do things that are really original or do something different. Because if academic writing is just to follow a formula and a structure, guess what? The machines will start writing the papers. The machines will start reviewing the papers. And the machines will be reading the papers, and you have a closed system. And it becomes, insignificant. Either we just sit and watch and make money out of it, or we say, look, this is not helping anyone.
I mean, there's a real risk with what you're proposing too. You see, this is the thing. From my experiences, anytime you try and do any original work, it's not valued and it does not count. Like from a higher ed academy point of view, it's not counted. It's always a question mark of what is that? That's not part of it doesn't fit in a neat box. And so what you're proposing is kind of a real risk. And I agree, not just early career scholars, I would say just in general, academics are under the pump like you'd never believe. And I share that concern with you, but it's a real challenge and risk to do something different because of those very reasons I've already kind of mentioned. I don't. Sorry, I didn't mean that as in like to challenge what you're saying, but it's not valued what you're saying, as in like doing original work. I mean,
so it's important to push back in all kind of ways. And again, you see the difference between the system and the practice. And if the practice is eaten up by the system, it destroys the practice. And there are countries that go really far in just having this system view of quality and don't care about, is the scholarship doing anything? Is it moving people?
Well, I mean, we're already at this stage now where AI is already marking work. It'll start reviewing. It'll also basically, universities are already advocating students and academics to use AI to write their work. It's just kind of, I actually, even though I'm supposed to be asking your last question, what are your thoughts on AI here in relation to writing and higher ed and just in general? What are your thoughts here?
Well, my thought, I think there is a big danger. There is the obvious danger that, again, the machine takes over from the human being. So it also produces a lot of alienation. I heard a beautiful talk by someone who works in the whole field of informatics and is very critical of AI. And she says, I went back to Marx and how he talks about alienation. And that is the biggest problem I see with what AI is doing. It is disconnecting us from our own work by offering all these things like, if you use AI, you can prepare your lessons much more quickly. And she said, I don't want to prepare my lessons much more quickly. I want to have the time to do that in a thoughtful way. So these are, dangerous lies to say, if you do it quicker, you can do more, or why are we doing this? So I worry a lot about AI. I also worry about the environmental impact, which I think is just unsustainable. If you, as soon as I read that Google applied for having 2 nuclear power plants to run their AI.
Oh yeah, the energy consumption is next level.
Really wrong.
Yeah, it's next level. Yeah. Interesting you use the Marxist term alienation. It's a new form of alienation, added to other forms of alienation as a concept. But I'm just conscious of the time. We could keep going here. I'm just conscious of the time. I'm supposed to be asking you your last question, and I'm going to do that right now. So my last question I always ask all my guests, do you think I've missed anything, or is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we had a wonderful conversation. We discussed some topics that are very close to my heart. We discussed some bigger questions. And again, for me, some new insights emerged. I think I'd never seen this tension between system and practice so clearly as it emerged in our conversation. So that's cool as well. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, thanks, Gert. We might leave it there because we really could go for another probably half an hour to an hour, and we don't want to. So thanks for listening, and Gert, thanks for accepting my invitation. We'll leave it there.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Bye for now.